Today's video doesn't have a theme. I'm kinda out of people to satirize, so today I'm just Neo, and I'm a filmmaker. Unlike Quinton Reviews, who, despite not being a filmmaker, made a film called Arbuckle, a Garfield fan film. Quinton Reviews does a lot of stuff on his channel, from reviews to commentary to satire, and other examples that are just taken directly from his About page. However, Quinton is probably most famous for his movie reviews, with some of his more popular videos being his review of The Thinning, his review of the Emoji Movie, and of course, How SpongeBob Predicted Meme Culture. Clearly a filmmaking intellectual. And yet, despite his clearly extensive knowledge on filmmaking, he doesn't really consider himself a filmmaker or even a film critic. Sarcasm aside, Quinton is pretty much just an internet comedian, making videos on whatever tickles his fancy and never really taking himself too seriously, which is something that I'll applaud him for, since I think that YouTube today is severely lacking in channels that are multifaceted and based in satire. However, the only thing that I'm interested in are his film reviews. Now, I've already made my thoughts on most internet movie critics perfectly clear. I feel like the majority of popular film critics on YouTube latched onto this use of satirical cynicism to make reviews that were more humorous and entertaining than they were informative and constructive, and I feel like the whole review as entertainment format really lost what little appeal it ever had to begin with sometime around the early 2010s, and to see someone hopping on that bandwagon this late in the game and still managing to gain a following is honestly surprising, especially given the nature of his reviews. They really aren't anything special. I mean, if you're familiar with other film critics within this genre like Ralph the Movie Maker or YMS, then you pretty much get the idea of what Quinton does. It's a good thing his channel is so multifaceted, because in all actuality, I don't think his channel would be able to survive on just his movie reviews alone. And this isn't to say that his movie reviews are bad, but they're just not very original, and they suffer from a lot of the same problems that other reviewers in this category suffer from. When skewed through the lens of comedic cynicism, these reviews become incomplete and inherently inaccurate breakdowns of the filmmaking process. Which makes sense because Quinton isn't a filmmaker. Which brings us back to Arbuckle, Quinton's first and only short film, and with over 20 movie reviews under his belt at the time of making it, does he know how to make his film better than the films that he tears apart? The film is centered around John Arbuckle as he struggles to find his place in the world, with his comic strip about gnats going absolutely nowhere and his social life falling apart as he isolates himself in his house with his pet cat, Garfield. The film is based less on the Garfield comic strip, or TV show, or movie, or whatever, and more on the actual real-life creator of Garfield, Jim Davis, who, prior to creating Garfield, ran a comic strip for 3 years called Norm Nat. This is a pretty interesting idea for a short film, a semi-biographical look at the creation of the Garfield comics that includes actual photos of the Norm Nat comic strip. John Arbuckle is played by Quinton himself, and how does he do with this performance? I mean, it's okay, I guess. John was always sort of a stick in the mud anyway, whose main shtick was to just be kind of lame and pathetic, so I think that for a project of this size, Quinton didn't really do anything particularly egregious with his performance. My only question would be why he chose to play John. He looks pretty much nothing like John whatsoever, so I don't see why he chose to play him, other than the fact that this video wouldn't be nearly as popular without the owner of the channel being the star of the film. The guy that plays Lyman doesn't look like Lyman either, but at least they gave a bit of an explanation to it.
Oh, finally! You've been begging Bertha to let you get a puppy for years.
Yeah, she finally agreed that I can get one if I shave my mustache.
The film opens with some pretty poorly done on-screen text that looks really bad, considering the fact that there are other parts of the film that have really good graphic elements, like the animated comic strips throughout the movie. These animations were done by Ben Basic, who is not only an amazing animator, but also the director for the game Neon Town, which makes me wonder why he didn't just get Ben to design a logo that he could use for the opening, or at the very least use a less basic, more interesting looking font. It doesn't help that we have to look at it for a really long time because this opening sequence is insanely long for absolutely no reason. It shows John making coffee, then pacing around, then back to making coffee, then more pacing, then back to coffee. Good lord, it's like this film's got ADHD or some shit. Either pick one thing to focus on, or just jump into the story already. We don't need to see a bunch of intercut footage played over lame house music for 2 minutes. Especially since the footage isn't really all that great to begin with. The shots are static, out of focus, and often terribly lit, which honestly perplexes me. When I reviewed King Candy, I was willing to forgive a lot of the bad cinematography because I understood that Ralph basically had no money to make this movie with. But here, Quinton's channel has already been a success for quite some time. He obviously had to pay Ben for these animations, as well as hire voice actors, and artists for the end credit sequence. So it's not like Quinton didn't have money to make this, it's just that it's going to other places rather than into expensive lighting gear and fancy shoulder rigs. Which is good, right? I mean, that's like resource filmmaking 101. After all, story is king, so getting the pieces that you absolutely need to tell your story is more important than all the fluff, right? Well, I feel like in the modern age of filmmaking where gear is cheaper than ever, not having any money starts to become less and less of a proper excuse. You don't need expensive light to produce a good image, you just have to know how to use the cheap lights the most effective way. And Quinton clearly doesn't. About halfway through the movie, John goes to a house party where he awkwardly tries to flirt with a girl before getting rejected, and the entire scene is lit by this harsh blue light off to the side. Assuming that this is a studio light of some sort, it's being used in probably the worst possible way. Let's see how we can improve this scene by just changing how we use the light. I'll be using just one LED light to fill this entire room, but rather than just shining it right onto the actors from the corner of the room, I can either bounce the light from the ceiling, move the actors closer to the wall and then bounce it from there, or set up a second light stand to use some white cardboard as a bounce board. If you have an extra set of hands, you can even get someone to hold a bed sheet in front of the light for some pretty high quality diffusion. Flip the whole setup around for the reverse shot and boom, instant cinematic lighting. And for just a couple more bucks, you could get some colored floodlights and really make it look like a house party. There's also elements of the cinematography that could be improved without spending any extra money. There's hardly any separation between foreground and background in any of these shots, and that can be fixed by simply pulling your actors away from the walls. The shot composition is also not really well thought out. Like in the scene where John is talking to Garfield, and even though Garfield is laying on the floor, the camera is only eye level and John is looking directly into it as if it were Garfield. If he was gonna do that, then he should have put the camera lower to the ground since that's where Garfield would actually be at, or if he was just gonna put it at eye level anyway, he should have just looked off to the side as if he were looking at Garfield on the floor rather than talk to the camera as if it were Garfield. The color of the film is also super flat and boring, which doesn't mesh well with the colorful comic bumpers throughout the film, and learning some simple color grading techniques would have really helped improve the look of the film. So I think that the mediocre cinematography here doesn't exactly come from a lack of money, but just Quinton not knowing how to make the best of his current equipment. There's also certain elements that filmmakers can't really afford to cheap out on. Sure, story is king, but you need the right tools to be able to tell that story. For example, the audio. The sound quality in Arbuckle is so bad in certain scenes that it's difficult to understand what the characters are saying, and other times the audio quality is really good because of the professional voice actors that Quinton hired to work on the project. This is only serving to handicap the story since now not only am I not able to follow the dialogue in certain scenes, but every time the audio quality changes, it pulls me out of the story. And the audio is so poorly mixed that I have to keep adjusting the volume on my speakers because the live action dialogue scenes are so much quieter than the voiceover scenes.
We see Norm standing outside, doing nothing at all.
I took Garfield to this dog park.
Regardless of whatever the budget is, it's never a good idea to cheap out on sound. If you can't afford a proper boom mic to capture clean on-set dialogue, then just use a condenser mic and ADR the entire fucking movie. Sure, it's more time consuming, but it'll at least make your audio smooth and consistent. The only parts of this movie that I would actually describe as good are the animated comics. Everything else is either bad or just mediocre. The writing is nothing special, and neither is the acting. It's pretty much just like any other no-budget short film that you'd see at a student film festival. This only further demonstrates that being able to critique a movie and being able to make a movie are two completely different things. And while Quinton doesn't consider himself a filmmaker, somebody that doesn't have much knowledge in the filmmaking process might watch his videos and be convinced that he's very knowledgeable in the subject of filmmaking. Which he isn't. Because if he was, then none of the flaws that I pointed out here would even exist. In conclusion, I'd say that this short is not really worth your time, unless you already really like Quinton reviews, and even then, it might not be for you, since none of Quinton's trademark cynicism and sarcasm is present in this film. There's plenty of other great short films on YouTube that are more worth your time, including one that I just uploaded recently, but at the end of the day, this was obviously a passion project for Quinton, and I don't think that he expects it to receive any sort of praise or mass attention. So that's why my final rating for Quinton's Arbuckle is a 4 out of 10. While the execution is really subpar, passion projects are always worth seeing through to the end, and I'm glad that Quinton got to make something different with all of his friends. My name is NeoJesus, and if you like what you see, consider subscribing. I'm always writing, shooting, and editing brand new videos all the time, so there's always something new to look forward to.